The 1961 Ferrari 250 GT California. Less than 100 were made. The owner spent 3 years restoring this car. It is his love, it is his passion. It is not a real Ferrari. Wait, what? And neither is this. Hi, I'm Shervin Nakhjavani, Associate Curator at the Peterson Automotive Museum. And today you're going to get a double feature because I'm going to talk about two very special cars in movie and television history. Two cars that may seem like they don't have that much to do with each other on the surface other than pretending to be Ferraris, but in fact they have a lot more parallels than you might think. First, let's address what they are because they're not a real Ferrari Daytona or a real 250 GT California. What you're actually looking at is a 1983 Mardikian 350 GTS Turbo and a 1985 Modena Spider California. And while they might not be real Ferraris, they are the real Ferraris actually used in Miami Vice and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But it's not their connection to those things that actually makes them all that interesting. It's their stories outside of those that's even more compelling, more wild, more full of twists and turns and lawsuits. Okay, let's start the story around 1980. Ferrari is already a household name in the US, synonymous with Italian design and performance and excellence. Their signature models like the 250, the 275, 365, and Dino have really cemented them as a serious enthusiast sports car brand. And after so many years, these older models are beginning to appreciate in value. So much so that it may make more financial sense for those who simply want to look like they're driving a Ferrari to just go out and build themselves a replica. In 1980, there's a dealership in Newport Beach, California called Trend Import Sales. Trend Import Sales sells trendy imports like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Ferrari, Porsche, Lamborghini, and there's a man there by the name of Albert Mardikian. He's the owner of the place, but Al is not just a salesman, he's an entrepreneur. And he's always looking for new ways to expand his business and set himself apart from the competition. Now, remember when I said that the value of these Ferraris was beginning to skyrocket? Well, that was also happening with the Shelby Cobra. And on one particular day, Mr. Mardikian called a man named Tom McBurnie into his office. McBurnie was a coach builder, and he was going to pitch Mardikian the idea of building a Cobra replica for him. But after Mardikian saw the budget that McBurnie had in mind, he said no. Now, it just so happened that there was this beautiful white Ferrari 365 GTS4 Daytona parked right out in front of Mardikian's office. It may not have been a new Ferrari at the time, but it was one of those older appreciating Ferraris I told you about. So McBurnie turned to Mardikian and said, "Hey, why don't we build a Daytona?" "Okay, what would you build it on?" he said. McBurnie's initial idea was a Camaro, but Mardikian wanted the car to have independent rear suspension, so the only real answer was a Corvette. The two men shook hands, and the deal was that Mardikian would supply the genuine Ferrari parts, while McBurnie would find the Corvettes on which he would build the cars. Now, here's the funny part. In order to make accurate body molds, McBurnie needed a real Daytona to work with. So Mardikian handed him the keys to that white one. Well, great. Except it wasn't his. The car was on consignment. And whether or not the owner actually was told that this car would be used for this special project, I'm not sure. But even if he was, I have a feeling maybe he was spared the full details, as in your car will be completely disassembled and then put back together. Who knows? I mean, hey, he wasn't going to keep it anyway, right? Wherever that car is today, its chassis number is 16859 for those real Daytona owners watching. You may have it. It took 2 years, but finally, the first Mardikian 350 GTS Turbo was built. 350 because it had a 350 small block V8 under the hood, GTS because that's what Ferrari called their Spider models, and Turbo because, yes, it did have a turbocharger under the hood, a Gale Banks twin turbo kit, actually. McBurnie went on to make 4 of these cars in total for Mardikian, and this is the 4th one. Meanwhile, over at NBC, the wheels were starting to turn on a new series called Miami Vice. Now, if you're above a certain age, then you remember how big of a deal this show was, but for anyone born in the late 70s or later, myself included, then we'd really need to take a moment to really talk about Miami Vice, because Miami Vice wasn't just a show. It was a phenomenon. Let me explain. When we talk about network television dramas, there's really only two ways to categorize it: before Miami Vice and after. Before, police dramas on TV were this formulated format with the same recycled theme music week after week, and really no sense of distinctive style when it came to how they showed you the story. The emphasis was on the acting and dialogue and not too much else, but along came Michael Mann and Anthony Yerkovich and Thomas Carter, and they really colored in the rest of the canvas. And they took elements from art house films and contemporary fashion and music videos and wove it all together into a mosaic that was stylized and gritty and raw, things that television had never even been before. And I'm confident that if Miami Vice hadn't existed, none of the modern TV dramas you know and love today would be the same. I know that's a bold claim to make, but just go back and watch the show and you'll see what I mean. You'll see the influences. And none of that even begins to cover how wide of an influence the show had culturally. It seemed like nearly everyone who watched the show at the time wanted to look and dress and feel as cool as Detective Sonny Crockett and Ricardo Tubbs, the two lead characters played by Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas. And that's probably the single best word to describe Miami Vice: cool. To call it the greatest TV show ever is probably too broad and subjective, but calling it the coolest may still hold up even 40 years later. I'll let you be the judge of that. I mean, people used to stay at home on Friday nights just so they could watch the show, then go out with friends. Some even like to say that the 80s didn't really start until September 16th, 1984, the night that the pilot episode aired. And that pilot episode contained the most famous scene from the entire show, the one that featured this car and the song In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins. What was so groundbreaking about that scene was that the song was used to carry it. There was no background noise, hardly any dialogue, and the cinematography was leaps and bounds over anything else on TV at the time. And it was the first time that a contemporary popular song was used in a series instead of the usual incidental music you would hear on shows at the time. Alright, so how did this particular car end up on Miami Vice? Well, originally a real Ferrari Daytona, chassis number 15297, was rented by Universal Studios as the hero car, but it only made it into one single shot before the owner decided to pull it since he wasn't comfortable with how it was being treated on set. Now luckily, Universal had already found out about the Mardikian and had leased this one since it was also black and tan. So when they lost the real thing, this one just took its place. And then they went back to Trend Import Sales and leased the very first of the four cars to serve as their stunt car. So if you've been paying attention, they used both the very first Mardikian and the very last one, cars number 1 and number 4. Mardikian had painted number 1 dark red, but Universal Studios painted it black to match the hero car. Pretty soon after the show began airing, Albert Mardikian himself started running into some serious legal trouble. Nothing that had to do with these cars. But in the early to mid-80s, there was something called the gray market in the US, and this meant that regular folks like you and I could go to Europe, buy a European car, and then import it into the US ourselves. But these cars weren't street legal. They didn't meet the US Department of Transportation's or the EPA's safety and emissions standards. So there were these independent compliance shops and emissions labs in the US that would do the work to make them legal. Mr. Mardikian was both an importer and conveniently had an emissions lab himself, which all sounded great on paper until it didn't. In 1985, Mardikian was indicted on 35 charges, which alleged that he never actually tested any of the 2,000 cars that he had imported. Mardikian pled guilty to 1 count of mail fraud and 9 counts of submitting false documents to the EPA, and Trend Import Sales went belly up. But wait a second. The 2 cars on Miami Vice were leased from Trend Import Sales, so what would happen to them? Universal immediately got Mardikian's attorneys on the phone, and an agreement was made to buy the cars outright. Except that the titles for the cars had been lost since Mardikian's assets had been seized. The California DMV wouldn't issue new titles without the cars physically there in California, and the cars couldn't leave Florida either because they were being used week after week to film the show. So they were stuck in this legal limbo. So, in an unprecedented move, the California DMV agreed to let the Metro-Dade Police Department in Miami act as a proxy to inspect the car and submit the paperwork to transfer ownership. Car number 1 started life as a 76 Corvette, and car number 4 started life as an 81, but on their new titles, they both became 84 models. With the two Mardikian cars safely in Universal's possession, it seemed like it would be smooth sailing from here. Except that Miami Vice's success was so universal, that it caught the attention of a certain Italian car company called Ferrari. Now, if you think that Ferrari would have been flattered that a show like Miami Vice was giving them free publicity and advertising, you'd be wrong. Ferrari was actually very upset that an obvious replica was masquerading as the real deal on national TV week after week. What makes this an obvious replica? Well, look at the headlights. Real Daytonas never had these quad rectangular units. They had round ones. Look at the wheels. These are supposed to mimic Barani wheels, but they were actually made by an American manufacturer called Zenith Wire Wheel Company in Campbell, California. Check out the taillights. They've been switched around since, but on the show, they had the amber lenses on the inside while the red ones were on the outside. I don't know why they did that, but that's the way it was on the show. The door handles on the real car, they were never exposed like this. They were hidden. The interior is another thing. The entire instrument cluster, the center console, all the way down to the handbrake, even the seats themselves, stock C3 Corvette units, the fender flares, these are wider than on the real thing. The lack of the side vent windows is another one. And the inserts on the seats have actually just been switched around to more closely resemble real Daytona seats. There were never any close-ups of the instrument cluster, but look, it's just a standard C3 Corvette unit with Mardikian branded faces stuck on. And the steering wheel, of course, is made by Momo, not by Ferrari. Now, if the writers on the show had simply called the car a Mardikian and left the Mardikian emblems on, there might not have been an issue. But they undoubtedly tried to pass the car off as a real Ferrari and even placed Ferrari emblems all over the car, which, I mean, come on, at that point you're just asking for a lawsuit. What's funny is that when the crew first did this, they didn't know where to put the front Ferrari badge. So they just sort of eyeballed it and placed it somewhere in the middle, above the headlights, not even perfectly centered. So, as you guessed, Ferrari threatened to sue Universal if they didn't get rid of these replicas. But cooler heads prevailed and a deal was struck between the two. Universal would write the fake Daytona off the show by blowing up a dressed up shell on screen, and Ferrari would supply them with two brand new black Testarossas. Pretty good deal if you ask me. So what would happen to the Mardikian cars? Well, here's where things get funny. When Universal got the two new Testarossas, they decided they needed a stunt car. Yes, as in another replica. A replica? That's how they got into this mess. I don't know if Ferrari knew about this, but Universal hired a man named Carl Roberts to disassemble the stunt Mardikian and turn it into a Testarossa-looking stunt car. But when he started looking closer, Roberts found out that the Mardikian just wasn't going to cut it. He needed a car with a rear mid-engine layout like the Testarossa. So he settled on a 72 Di Tommaso Pantera and started working on that. And he must have been a pretty good negotiator too, because the deal absolutely worked in his favor. Carl Roberts would get to keep both the Mardikian cars and lease the new stunt car to Universal. And the producers decided to repaint the black Testarossas white so they would look more visible and striking in nighttime scenes. So, Carl Roberts gets the two Mardikians in 1986 and he plans on using them as demonstrator cars for his business in Tennessee, where he builds, you guessed it, Daytona replicas. And by this time, because of the show's massive success, several companies had started selling kits of these cars, including Tom McBurnie himself, under his own name. Well, the story goes that over at Roberts Motor Company, one day, a customer showed up to take delivery of his new Roberts Miami Spider. Every company had a different name for these. But when he was told it wasn't ready yet, he lost his temper and demanded his money back. Always the businessman, Carl Roberts offered him car number 4, the hero car, and he took it. After a short amount of time, that owner listed it for sale in the DuPont registry. The person who would buy it brought it home on his test drive and asked his neighbor what he thought. "Should I buy this car or a real Ferrari?" he asked. "Buy this one," said the neighbor. So he did. But it wouldn't be long before he also decided to sell it in 1988, and that neighbor who liked it bought it, and he still owns it to this day. I tracked him down last year, and this is the very first time the car has ever been on public display in a museum, unrestored, just the way it appeared in the show. We're thrilled to have it here. But this story isn't as unique as you might think, because as I hinted at earlier, the rising desirability of these classic Ferraris at the time, the real ones, meant that the studios couldn't really afford to use them in their productions. Too much to buy, too much to lease, too much of a liability to insure, and too much of a shame to destroy if the script called for it. You might know where I'm going with this. In 1985, a writer and director named John Hughes was working on a new movie called, anyone? Ferris Bueller's Day Off, about a high school senior who wants to skip school one last time and bring his friend along for the ride. How long did it take for him to write the script? Anyone know? It took him 1 week to write the script, and even though the story originally called for an AMG modified Mercedes, Hughes soon realized that it wasn't going to be special enough. Okay, you know what? I can't do this character. Let's just call this outfit Mr. Peterson. And no, not this Peterson. That Mr. Peterson.
Anyone? The Great Depression.
In the script, Cameron's father needed to have something very special, something very classic, something very, very expensive, something that would warrant the type of extreme anxiety that Cameron had throughout the whole movie. And at the time, Hughes was living here in LA, and he heard that a new company called Modena Design and Development was making convincing replicas of the classic Ferrari 250 GT California Spider from the late 50s and early 60s. So he called them up and asked them to bring one so he could see it in person. He liked what he saw, and he asked if he could lease it for production. The problem was Modena Design and Development was really just two young guys in a garage. And that car that Hughes saw in person, it was their only one so far. It was their prototype. And it had already been sold to someone else. But of course, they agreed to build 3 new cars for Paramount Pictures, one complete car that would be leased, and an incomplete one along with a rolling shell that would be purchased. The complete car would be used as the hero car for wide shots, the incomplete car would be used for close-up shots of the actors, and the rolling shell would be used in the climactic scene of the movie. Look, I'm really trying hard not to give out spoilers, but come on, the movie's almost 40 years old. If you still haven't seen it, what are you doing? Life moves pretty fast. Go and watch it. It took many long nights, but Mark Goyette and Neil Glassmoyer, the two brains behind Modena Design and Development, finally got it done. They met their deadline, and in the fall of 1985, filming began in Chicago. The car itself was similar in concept to the Mardikian, but only in concept. Whereas the Mardikian was really a Corvette in disguise, the Modena was based on nothing. It was truly an original design, and I know that sounds funny to say about a car that was obviously trying to copy something else, but the chassis and the frame underneath, totally custom built. The bodywork, not made from Ferrari molds. The external parts, not genuine Ferrari. The taillights and the trunk lid were from an MGB. In fact, neither Goyette nor Glassmoyer had ever even seen a real Ferrari 250 GT in person before. All they had to go off of were photos, which makes this creation all the more impressive. Of course, there are some clear giveaways for those of you who are eagle-eyed that it's not the real deal. Ferrari made 2 versions of the 250 GT California Spider, a long wheelbase version and a short wheelbase version. This is neither. The rear end is obviously trying to mimic a short wheelbase car, because the long wheelbase rear end had a more squared off design and different taillights altogether. But if it was supposed to be a short wheelbase car, the area behind the doors would be shorter. The front fenders would have 3 vents, not 4. And regardless of which version it was, the front end should be more round and bulbous and less stretched out. And the differences don't end there. The 1961 model year in the script is really just a misnomer. Those of you who have seen the movie may already know that, like Miami Vice, a real Ferrari was actually used in just one scene. When Cameron and Ferris first walk into the garage and see the car for the first time, those close-ups you see are of the real thing, a short wheelbase car. And you can see the differences there too. That car's front fenders only had 3 side vents. But there is one other thing you may have noticed: the headlights. On the real Ferrari, the chrome bezels have 4 very visible screws to hold them in. The Modena had none. On this car today, you'll notice that it does have the Ferrari-style bezels, and that's because it's been restored to more closely resemble a real Ferrari rather than a Modena Spider California, which I guess was the whole point to begin with. You'll also notice that the front turn signals are now amber and the front fenders have Ferrari crests on them, which weren't there before. This car has had an interesting life. Remember how I said there were 3 cars used in the movie in various states of completion? Well, the story goes that on set, these cars were notoriously unreliable. Matthew Broderick, who played Ferris, said in 2010, "My memory of this car is that it often didn't start. That's all I remember." Alan Ruck, who played Cameron, had even less choice words to say. Apparently, they had to shoot the valet scene 16 times because the car wouldn't start. 16 times. Ruck said that when one of the cars was sent out the window, the crew actually cheered. They were jumping up and down. The duties of hero car were passed between the complete car and the incomplete car, depending on whichever one could start that day. This car was the only one that was equipped with an automatic transmission because apparently Matthew Broderick, who played Ferris, didn't know how to drive a manual. And it was the only one used in the famous jump scene with the 2 valets. After filming wrapped, the car went back to Modena Design and Development and got fixed up and sold to its first owner in San Diego. Then it changed hands a few times and went actually to the UK, where its current owner bought it in 2010 and brought it back to the US to be restored. And it's been making the rounds at different museums ever since, even being inducted into the National Historic Vehicle Register and displayed at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Now, that's pretty cool. As for Modena Design and Development, just like with Miami Vice, the people at Ferrari watched Ferris Bueller's Day Off and went after them in court. In fact, both McBurnie Coachcraft and Modena Design and Development, which were coincidentally located within 5 minutes of each other in the San Diego area, were sued by Ferrari at the same time. Modena's defense was that their 2 designers had never actually seen a real Ferrari 250 GT in person, so their car was really more of an inspired homage rather than an exact copy. And considering all the differences, that was probably valid. They were able to keep making their cars with some revisions until they sold the company. As for McBurnie, Ferrari won a lawsuit against him, and his facility was burned to the ground by arson in 1989. That spelled the end for the McBurnie California Spider. By the end, he had made 4 Mardikian 350 GTS turbos, 88 McBurnie California Spiders, and over 350 kits of the California Spider. That's a lot. And today, both of these cars are on display right here at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, where you can come and see them in person until April 2026 as part of our exhibit called Totally Awesome: Cars and Culture of the 80s and 90s. We may not be an art museum, but we do showcase works of art on wheels. Now, I've talked over and over about how these cars are not what they appear to be, but in what way would you really notice they're not Ferraris besides how they look? I know how. Come on, live a little. Okay, I'm not Don Johnson. And to be honest, nobody else can pull off an outfit like this better than he can. But these aren't Ferraris. And if you really think about it, they've been cosplaying as something they're not for over 40 years. Now, because of the way that the exhibits are set up, we couldn't take the Ferris Bueller Ferrari out as well. So you'll just have to imagine how a Ford 302 V8 from a 74 Torino sounds like. Now, I have no shame in admitting that I've never driven a real Daytona before. But I don't think you need to in order to realize that this isn't one. And it's such an 81 Corvette. I mean, everything from the way the car rides, to the center console, to the dash, the gauges, the ignition switch, the seats, it's all pure GM, pure Corvette. And I honestly think it adds to the car's charm. And I honestly like looking down at these gauges, knowing that there was a handmade craft and attention to detail that went into them. You can see the Mardikian logos on the gauges, which I think is a cool thing. And it's surreal to experience all this because if you couldn't already tell, I genuinely am a fan of the show. I've seen every episode. And they often say that meeting your heroes can be disappointing, but I think in the case like this, it's just not what you would expect. But to be honest, I'm beginning to kind of wonder why. Because if you watch that famous scene with the song In the Air Tonight, you can't actually hear the engine. It's intentionally left out. And your mind kind of fills the rest of the gaps in. That's the magic of cinema. Now, in other episodes, the sound of a real Ferrari was definitely dubbed in, but it never really took center stage on the show because of the show's heavy use of music. I mean, this was a show that pretty much used at least one popular song, if not several, over the course of each episode. And when they weren't using popular music, they were using Jan Hammer's signature soundtrack. So the sound of the engine wasn't really ever heard, whether it was real or not. Now, when the cars were brought in by Universal, they had their turbochargers removed, and that was to make the cars easier to work on, more reliable. And it's said that they actually had their motors replaced by crate motors, just stock 350 small block V8s. And that's what the car has now. Maintenance-wise, I think the Mardikian is definitely the better way to go, more friendlier on the wallet. Now, it's funny because when we watch the show, we kind of make these assumptions in our minds, which is that the car is a Ferrari, the car has a V12, and the car is a manual. Even though I don't think it ever says it in the script that the car is a manual, it never really shows the automatic shifter down here. But I will say that even though the car plays a manual car in the show, if you're driving the car in LA, it's better to have an automatic. Now, one cool thing about this car that you wouldn't expect to see in a hero car from a movie or TV show is that despite being an automatic, it actually has 3 pedals. Now, why does it have 3 pedals? Is that a clutch? No, it's not. It's actually a second brake cylinder and pedal. Believe it or not, this car, even though it wasn't the stunt car, it had to have extra capability to do tight turns and maneuvers that a stock Corvette wasn't able to do. So that's why they added a second brake cylinder and pedal. If I do press each brake pedal, you can actually see the car slow down. So here's one, and here's the other. There you go. Now, one thing that we figured out was that when you do press that second brake pedal, it doesn't actually turn on the brake lights. That's not something you see in a lot of movie cars, let alone hero cars. And it's pretty awesome. Or should I say, totally awesome. So there you have it. The authentic fake Ferraris from Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Miami Vice. Now, I have a question for you. If money were no object, which one would you rather have? A real Ferrari version of these, or the screen-used replicas? If you have trouble deciding, maybe you should come and see them in person. I know which one I'd choose. Special thanks to Bob, both of them, yes, the owners of these cars actually also share the same name, for loaning them to us, that is, and everyone here at the museum who made this possible. Until next time, I'm Shervin Nakhjavani at the Peterson. Thanks for watching. You're still here? It's over. Go watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off or Miami Vice, whichever one you haven't seen yet. Go.